Hello everyone, friends. Do you know where the most incredible hidden stories actually lie? Not in the loud battles that textbooks detail. They are concealed in silence, in abandoned laboratories, in remote villages, and within the minds of solitary geniuses. Today, we will discuss such individuals. Those who witnessed things that couldn't possibly exist, created inventions that shouldn't have functioned, and managed to survive in situations where death seemed the only escape. So get ready, it's going to be fascinating. And as is our tradition, don't forget to like this video and comment on which city you're from. It really helps our channel grow. Let's begin. Story number 1. The year when summer was stolen. 1816. In Europe, it was dubbed the Year of the Pauper, while in America, it was called the Year Without Summer. Summer simply did not arrive. In June, snow fell in New York City. In July, rivers froze in Pennsylvania. In August, icy rains fell in France, destroying the grape harvest. The sky above the world took on a strange yellowish-brown hue, and the sun appeared as a pale, sickly disk. People were terrified. They believed the end of the world had come. Priests preached about divine punishment. Scientists proposed crazy theories regarding sunspots. Famine set in. An outbreak of typhus erupted in Ireland. Farmers in Switzerland resorted to eating cats and rats. No one understood what was happening. The cause of the global cooling did not lie in the heavens or in humanity's sins. It was located 12,000 kilometers from Europe, on the tiny Indonesian island of Sumbawa. A year earlier, in April 1815, the Tambora volcano erupted. It was the largest eruption in human history. The sound of the explosion could be heard 2,500 kilometers away. The volcano released 150 cubic kilometers of ash and sulfur into the stratosphere. That was enough to blanket the entire United Kingdom in a layer of ash 60 centimeters thick. This ash curtain enveloped the globe, reflecting sunlight and preventing it from warming the Earth. The global temperature dropped by 3 degrees. While it may seem like a small amount, it was sufficient to disrupt the planet's climate system. This summer that never was brought not only famine, but also great creations. In Switzerland, on the shores of Lake Geneva, a group of young Englishmen, including Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and his wife Mary, sat in a house unable to venture outside due to endless rain. Byron suggested, "Let's each write a scary story." That night, Mary Shelley conceived Frankenstein. In Germany, due to the death of horses, oats failed to grow, leaving them without feed. Inventor Carl Dreis created a walking machine, the prototype of the bicycle. One volcano on a forgotten island changed the climate, caused famine, and gifted the world with a monster and a bicycle. The world didn't even know the name of its tormentor. It was only after 100 years that scientists connected the year without summer to the eruption of Tambora, demonstrating how fragile our civilization is in the face of Earth's breath. The volcano enveloped the planet in ash, bringing hunger and despair. Yet sometimes darkness arises not from the sky, but from the hearts of people. And that's when a hero is needed. Someone willing to step into this man-made darkness, to bring light to it. Our next hero was a journalist who witnessed hell on Earth, exposed the truth about it, and paid the ultimate price with his life. This is story number 2. A man who encountered famine, yet no one believed him. Moscow, 1933. The capital of the Soviet Union was pulsating with the frantic rhythm of building a new world. Foreign journalists, lounging in the Metropole Hotel bar, sipped vodka, listened to jazz, and penned articles about the grand achievements of the 5-year plan. Officially, the country was alive with enthusiasm, but whispers of horror circulated in the shadows. Rumors spoke of people in Ukraine, Europe's breadbasket, who were reduced to eating tree bark as villages succumbed into silence. It was into this Moscow that a young Welsh journalist, Gareth Jones, arrived. He was ambitious and naive, having just interviewed Hitler and believing that journalism possessed the power to change the world. He wanted to see the truth with his own eyes. Defying all restrictions, Jones purchased a train ticket and secretly disembarked at a small station in Ukraine. He walked through snow-covered fields, and what he witnessed shattered him. This was not a famine brought on by drought. It was a man-made, orchestrated hell. Abandoned villages where no smoke rose from corpses, people with faces swollen from starvation, resembling specters. He saw children with distended bellies and eyes that looked old and hollow. He spent several days in that land, sharing his bread with the peasants until his supplies ran out. He returned to Moscow a changed man. He boarded a train to Berlin and, at his first press conference, revealed the truth. He cried out about millions perishing, that the Soviet government was seizing the last grain from farmers to sell to the West and buy machinery. The world should have recoiled in horror, but instead, the world decided that Garrett Jones was a liar. His main critic was Walter Duranty, the head of the Moscow bureau for the New York Times, a Pulitzer Prize winner and the most influential journalist of that era. From his comfortable office in Moscow, Duranty penned a rebuttal article. "There is no famine," he proclaimed. "Only malnutrition in some areas due to poor harvests." Western intellectuals and politicians, enamored with the communist experiment, chose to believe Duranty rather than some upstart from Wales. Jones was blacklisted. His career was obliterated. Friends turned away from him. He became an outcast for daring to speak an inconvenient truth. It would take many years after archives were opened for the world to acknowledge that the Holodomor occurred, claiming millions of lives. Garrett Jones was right, but he did not live to see the day of recognition. 2 years later, in 1935, he was killed under mysterious circumstances in Mongolia. He was merely 30 years old. Jones paid for the truth with his life. But sometimes the truth can destroy not just a person, but an entire scientific theory, burying it for decades. Our next story is about a humble monk who, while growing peas in the monastery garden, unveiled the laws of life, yet the world was unprepared to hear him. This is story number 3. A legacy buried in the monastery garden. The Austrian Empire, 1856. In the quiet garden of the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Brno, a task began that would revolutionize the world. But the world was unaware of this. The worker himself, a humble monk named Gregor Mendel, was also oblivious. He was a teacher who had failed the biology teaching examination twice. People regarded him as kind-hearted yet not particularly capable. Each day for 8 years, Mendel tended to his garden. He didn't merely cultivate peas. He conversed with them in a language that had yet to exist, a language of mathematics and statistics. His tools were simple: a brush made from camel hair, a pair of tweezers, and boundless patience. He cross-pollinated plants with yellow peas and those with green, plants with smooth seeds and those with wrinkled ones. He manually pollinated 28,000 plants. Then, he opened up hundreds of thousands of pods and counted each pea. To an outsider, it appeared as a form of meditative madness, a monk obsessed with peas. However, in his notebooks filled with columns of numbers, Mendel discerned patterns that no one had seen before. He recognized laws. At that time, science believed that heredity functioned like the blending of paints, offspring being an average of their parents. But Mendel observed otherwise. He realized that traits do not mix, they are inherited as distinct, indivisible units. He discerned dominant and recessive traits. He understood that a child might resemble a grandparent instead of a parent. He essentially discovered genes without even knowing that term. In 1865, he presented the results of his 8 years of work to a local society of naturalists. 40 learned men politely listened to the monk's lecture on the mathematical proportions in pea hybrids. They applauded, but asked no questions. They comprehended not a word. For them, botanists accustomed to describing leaf shapes, his numbers and formulas sounded like gibberish. His work was published in the Society's Transactions. Mendel sent out 40 copies of his report to leading scientists across Europe. No one responded. The greatest discovery in the history of biology was met with deafening silence. Mendel passed away in 1884, having never received recognition. He was buried as the abbot of the monastery, not as the father of genetics. His scientific contributions gathered dust in libraries for 35 years. It wasn't until 1900 that three scientists in three different countries independently rediscovered his laws, coming across the forgotten article by the monk from Brunn with astonishment. They realized that this solitary genius had outpaced them by an entire generation, working in his garden with tweezers and a notebook. The world was unprepared for Mendel's quiet revolution, buried beneath layers of statistics. However, our next story depicts a revolution that was loud, bloody, and fiery, one that the world sought to hastily forget and erase from textbooks. We will journey to a city that was completely destroyed, not by war, but by hate, and the truth about it only surfaced nearly a century later. Story number 4, a city erased from the maps and memories. Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. In an era of brutal racial segregation, the Greenwood District stood as a marvel. It was referred to as Black Wall Street. This was the most prosperous African-American neighborhood in the United States. It boasted its own banks, hospitals, theaters, and luxurious hotels. Black doctors, lawyers, and businessmen established their own independent realm of success. This infuriated many white residents of Tulsa, who viewed Greenwood as a challenge to the established order. On the 30th of May, a 19-year-old named Dick Rowland, an African-American shoe shiner, entered an elevator in the Drexel building. The elevator operator was 17-year-old white girl Sarah Page. What transpired in the elevator remains uncertain. Sarah screamed. Dick ran out. A vendor from a nearby store summoned the police. The following day, the Tulsa Tribune published a sensational headline: "Black man attacks white girl in elevator." The rumor, as is often the case, grew monstrous. The newspaper even printed an article calling for the lynching of the black man. That evening, a mob of white men, armed with rifles and pitchforks, gathered at the courthouse where Dick Rowland was held, demanding his extradition. In response, a group of African-American World War I veterans also armed themselves and arrived to protect him. A stray shot rang out, and the city erupted. This was not merely a brawl, it was war. Thousands of white residents, incited by authorities and Ku Klux Klan members, surged into Greenwood. They looted homes, broke into stores, and assaulted and murdered anyone they encountered. The police not only failed to intervene, but they also handed out weapons to the white mob while arresting black individuals who attempted to defend themselves. The most horrific events unfolded that night. Private planes appeared over Greenwood, dropping dynamite and incendiary devices onto homes and businesses. Black Wall Street was engulfed in flames. By the morning of the 31st of May, a once thriving community lay in smoking ruins. 35 blocks were burned to the ground. Estimates suggest that between 100 and 300 individuals lost their lives. 10,000 people were left homeless. But the most devastating aftermath was yet to come. The city chose to forget. All records of the massacre were destroyed. Articles in newspapers were excised. Eyewitness accounts were hidden away in archives. Authorities declared it was merely a riot instigated by the black community. The truths about the planes, the police's role, and the scale of the killings were buried for 75 years. This tragic event was absent from textbooks. A whole generation grew up unaware that beneath their feet lay the ashes of a civil war. It was only in 1997 that an inquiry commission was formed to restore the truth. The city of Tulsa formally apologized, but the scars remained. Tulsa had been consumed by the flames of hatred. However, our next story is about a man who, conversely, created a fire of love. He was a priest who secretly became a protector of lovers, risking his reputation and life, and for this, he was beheaded. You know this man's name, but his true story remains unknown to you. Story number 5, the real story of Saint Valentine. The Roman Empire, 2nd century AD. Emperor Claudius II Gothicus, known for his cruelty, faced a dilemma. Men were reluctant to join the army. Claudius concluded that love was to blame. According to him, married soldiers were too attached to their homes and families, making them poor warriors. He issued an edict forbidding young men from marrying. For those in love in Rome, it felt like a death sentence. Yet, in the shadows of catacombs and small churches, there was a man who dared to challenge the emperor. His name was Valentine. He was an ordinary Christian priest, or possibly a bishop. The details here are somewhat vague. He believed that marriage is a sacred bond blessed by God, and that no emperor had the right to annul it. Valentine started to secretly marry soldiers with their beloved. Under the cover of night, by candlelight, risking capture, he united hearts that the law sought to separate. He became the patron of forbidden love. But secrets inevitably come to light. Valentine was arrested and thrown into prison. Legend has it that while in confinement, he fell in love with the blind daughter of his jailer. Through the strength of his faith, or perhaps his medical knowledge, he healed her, and she regained her sight. Before his execution, he penned a heartfelt farewell letter to her. He signed it, "Your Valentine." On the 14th of February, around the year 270, he was beheaded. His heroic act was not forgotten. 2 centuries later, Pope Agellius I canonized him and declared February 14th the day of St. Valentine. However, he did this not solely for the sake of love. At that time, a pagan festival called Lupercalia was occurring. It was a wild, uninhibited celebration of fertility, complete with sacrifices and erotic games. The church sought to replace it with something more respectable. The story of the martyred lover was a perfect fit. Thus, thanks to the bravery of one priest and the cunning of one pope, we have a day when we exchange heart-shaped cards. Yet, behind this commercial facade lies the true story of a man who sacrificed his life for the right of people to declare their love at the altar. Valentine perished for love, while the heroine of the following tale, on the contrary, survived due to her hatred. Hatred for the man who left her to die in the wilderness. She traversed 250 kilometers through the Australian outback, driven only by a thirst for revenge. Her story became a national epic. Story number 6. The Woman Who Sought Vengeance. Australia, 1977. Lillian Alling was a Russian émigré living in New York. She was unhappy. She longed for home, for the Siberian forest she had known in her childhood, and she decided to return. But she lacked the funds for a ticket. So she made a decision that seemed insane. She would walk. She crossed all of North America, reached Alaska, somehow made it across the Bering Strait, and eventually found herself in Siberia. However, the Soviet authorities arrested her as a spy and deported her. But Lillian did not give up. She attempted again. In 1927, she reached Western Australia. There, she met a man named Jack Greaves. He was a bushman, a hunter, and an expert on the wilderness. He promised to guide her across the desert to the northern coastline. They set off on their journey, but soon Greaves realized that Lillian did not intend to pay him. He became angry. One morning, deep in the heart of the Gibson Desert, he beat her, took her food, water, and compass, shattered her rifle, and left her to die. This was a death sentence. Surrounding her were hundreds of kilometers of searing sand, venomous snakes, and no water in sight. But Greaves underestimated the Russian woman. Lillian did not lie down to die. She was driven not by the will to survive, but by a desire for revenge. "I will find him and kill him," she decided. She followed his trail. For 2 months, she trekked 250 kilometers. She survived on wild berries that she learned to identify by watching the birds. She figured out how to locate water by digging in the dry riverbeds. She spent nights in caves. Using stones, she killed snakes and lizards, cooking them over a fire she created by friction. The Aborigines she encountered were astonished. They saw a white woman traveling alone in places even they traveled only in groups. They dubbed her the Ghost of the Desert. Eventually, she reached civilization, a small settlement of cattle ranchers. Her tale became sensational news. The police apprehended Jack Griggs. He was put on trial, but not for attempted murder. It was difficult to prove that charge, so he was tried instead for theft. He received a light sentence. What happened to Lillian afterward remains a mystery. She vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. Perhaps she found a way to return to Russia. Her story became an Australian legend, a testament to human resilience fueled by the most potent force in the universe, the thirst for justice. Lillian survived through hatred, whereas the hero of the next tale survived thanks to a cat. But not just any cat, a ship's cat who endured 3 shipwrecks and became a talisman for the British fleet. His name was Unsinkable Sam. Story number 7. A cat with 9 lives and 3 shipwrecks. During World War II, the German battleship Bismarck, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, embarked on its first and final mission. A black and white cat named Oscar lived on board, amid the roar of cannons and the bustle of sailors. In May 1941, the British fleet launched a hunt for Bismarck. After a fierce battle, the battleship was sunk. Of the 2,200 crew members, just over 100 survived. As the British destroyer Cossack rescued survivors, the sailors spotted something in the water clinging to a piece of wreckage. It was Oscar, wet, frightened, but alive. He was brought aboard and became the Cossack's mascot. For several months, Oscar served in the Royal Navy, catching mice and enjoying rations. But in October of that same year, while escorting convoys in the Mediterranean, the Cossack was torpedoed by a German submarine. The explosion severed the bow of the destroyer. 159 lives were lost. The ship was ablaze but remained afloat. The crew transferred to another vessel, but Oscar stayed on the listing smoldering wreck. When it became clear that the Cossack was beyond rescue, the British sent a rescue boat for the cat. They found him on the deck, calm as ever. Oscar was taken to a base in Gibraltar and was renamed. He was now known as Unsinkable Sam. His third and final ship was the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, a legendary vessel that participated in the hunt for Bismarck. The sailors believed that a cat who survived 2 disasters would bring them good luck. In November 1941, just 1 month after the sinking of the Cossack, Ark Royal, returning from Malta, was torpedoed by the same German submarine U-81. The aircraft carrier sustained a massive hole and began to list slowly. The captain attempted to bring it to Gibraltar, but ultimately, the order was given to abandon ship. The rescue boat, picking people out of the water, encountered a plank on which sat a cat. He was fierce, yet completely unharmed. After the 3rd shipwreck, the Admiralty decided they had had enough. The Unsinkable Sam was retired to shore. He was appointed chief mousetrap in the residence of the Governor-General of Gibraltar and subsequently sent to a retirement home for sailors in Belfast. He passed away in 1955. His pastel portrait hangs in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. Sam the cat survived 3 wars at sea, but the hero of the next story endured a war that raged within him. He was a man with 2 minds, and they were perpetually at odds with each other, causing his hands to have a life of their own. Story number 8. A war inside one head. Imagine that your left hand is your fiercest enemy. You try to button your shirt with your right hand, while the left hand is unbuttoning it at the same time. You wish to embrace your wife, but your left hand slaps her in the face. You cannot control it. The hand has its own life, obeying an alien will. But that will is also yours. This is not a horror film plot. It is a real condition known as alien hand syndrome. One of the most famous patients who suffered from it was Karen Byrne. In the 1970s, Karen endured severe epilepsy. To save her, doctors performed a radical surgery called callosotomy. They severed the corpus callosum, a bundle of nerve fibers connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain. The surgery alleviated the seizures, but gave rise to a new monster. Her brain split into 2 independent personalities trapped within one skull. The left hemisphere, responsible for speech, logic, and the right side of the body, remained the old Karen, while the right, controlling emotions, imagery, and the left side, became a rebel. Chaos ensued. Her left hand would turn off the television that her right hand was watching. It would take her cigarettes and extinguish them. When Karen attempted to make a phone call, her left hand would throw the receiver down. Once, after an argument with her mother, Karen tried to hit her with her right hand, but her left hand seized her right and prevented it from happening. Her own hand defended her from herself. The scientists studying Karen were thrilled. They could communicate with each hemisphere separately. If they presented an image in the right visual field, the information went to the left, verbal hemisphere, and Karen could say what she saw. However, If the image was shown in the left visual field, the information went to the right, nonverbal hemisphere, and Karen would reply, "I see nothing." Yet her left hand could draw that object. This provided direct evidence that two distinct consciousnesses reside within our heads. Karen Byrne spent the rest of her life trying to reconcile the two foes inside her. She learned to control her alien hand by assigning it tasks. She became a living laboratory that helped us understand that our sense of self is not a monolith, but a fragile union of two different worlds. Most Karen was divided by a scalpel, but the hero of the next story divided his life willingly, voluntarily locking himself in a cave for 200 days in complete darkness to comprehend the nature of time. And when he emerged, he believed only 100 days had passed. Story number 9. The Man Who Lost Time. French speleologist Michel Siffre had been fascinated by caves and the concept of time since childhood. He grappled with the question, what is time? Is it an objective reality or merely a habit imposed upon us by the sun and clocks? In 1962, at the age of 23, he decided to embark on a radical experiment. He descended into the Sarasso cave in the French Alps without any clocks, calendars, or sunlight, completely isolated from the outside world. His goal was to live there for 2 months, relying solely on his internal biological clock. Above ground, a group of assistants watched over him. Michel was supposed to call them via a field phone whenever he woke, ate, or fell asleep, so they could record his cycles. He had no sense of time. The initial days felt torturous. It was cold, with the cave's temperature hovering around 0, 100% humidity, and perpetual darkness. The only sounds were the dripping water and the beating of his own heart. However, his body began to adapt. He realized that his internal day was not 24 hours, but rather 24 of his own unique hours, as he went to sleep and woke up slightly later each day. To him, time seemed to stretch. He was able to stay awake for 36 hours straight, then rest for 12. He read, explored the cave, and conducted experiments, such as attempting to count to 120 at a rhythm of 1 second to check how his internal metronome functioned. He lost track of the days. When his assistants called him to say, "Michel, it's time to come out, the experiment is over," he was shocked. "Already?" he asked. "But it's only been 35 days. "Michel," they replied, 58 days have passed. Today is September 17th. He had lost nearly a month. When he was brought back to the surface, he was blinded by the light. His initial steps on the grass were unsteady, reminiscent of a newborn. Yet his experiment had demonstrated the existence of internal clocks in humans long before it became mainstream in science. Michel Siffre conducted several more similar experiments, including a 6-month stay in a cave in Texas. He sacrificed years of his life to understand the nature of time and prove that it flows differently when the sun doesn't watch over you. Michel lived in darkness to comprehend light. In contrast, the protagonist of the next story brought light into the darkest corners of the world. She was a journalist who pretended to be insane to expose the horrors of a mental institution. Her report changed America. Story number 10. 10 Days in the House of the Insane. New York, 1887. Nellie Bly, born Elizabeth Cochran, was a young and audacious journalist. She approached the newsroom of the New York World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer, with a wild idea. "I will pretend to be insane," she said, "and get into the women's mental ward on Blackwell's Island. I will write about what's really going on there." The editor, taken aback by her audacity, agreed. Nellie began to prepare. She practiced in front of a mirror, adopting a mad expression. She stopped bathing, wore an old dress, and checked into a cheap boarding house. There, she began to act strangely, screamed at night, refused to sleep, and asserted that everyone around her was insane. The boarding house owner called the police. Nellie was brought to court. The judge, upon observing her lost expression, promptly rendered his verdict. Poor thing. It's clear that insanity should send her to Blackwell Island. The plan had worked. As soon as the doors of the asylum closed behind Zanili, she stopped pretending. She began to behave completely normally, but it was too late. The doctors and nurses noticed no difference. The more rationally she acted, the more insane they deemed her. Her calm demeanor was perceived as cunning, and her inquiries were viewed as paranoia. What she witnessed inside was hell. The patients were fed rotten meat and stale bread. They were forced to sit for hours on hard benches in unheated rooms, not allowed to move or speak. They were bathed in icy water, having buckets poured over their heads without changing the water after other patients. The nurses were cruel. They beat the women, choked them, and bound them with ropes. Many of the patients were not insane, but simply impoverished immigrants who could not speak English, or women abandoned by their husbands. Nellie spent 10 days in this place. She saw healthy individuals lose their minds from terror and hopelessness. On the 10th day, as arranged, a lawyer from the newspaper arrived at the hospital and demanded her release. 2 days later, an article about her appeared in the New York World. 10 days in a madhouse. It was an explosion. The public was in shock. An investigation began. The city allocated an additional $1 million to improve conditions in mental hospitals. The cruel nurses were dismissed. New regulations for examining and caring for patients were implemented. Nellie Bly became a star. She didn't just write a sensation, she changed the system, becoming the voice of the voiceless. Nellie feigned illness to help the healthy. However, the hero of the next story was perfectly healthy, yet was declared insane and confined in a leper colony, where he lived in solitude for 30 years, waiting for a wife who never came. Story number 11. The Curse of the Healthy Man. Hawaii, the island of Molokai, early 20th century. It was a place of exile, the island of lepers. People diagnosed with leprosy, Hansen's disease, were forcibly taken here from all over America. They were torn from their families, stripped of their names, assigned numbers, and left to die in the Kalaupapa colony, isolated from the world by the ocean and impenetrable cliffs. John Eli was a young Hawaiian man. He was married to a beautiful girl named Olivia. They loved each other deeply. However, one day, Olivia developed strange spots on her skin. The doctors declared it leprosy. She was taken to Molokai. John was heartbroken. He could not live without his wife, and he made an unfathomable decision. He voluntarily followed her. He boarded a ship heading to hell and landed on the shores of Kalaupapa. He told the authorities that he was also ill. He found Olivia. They lived together in a small hut under the shade of palm trees. John took care of her, treated her sores, and fed her. He was the only healthy person in this realm of pain and despair. He watched the disease slowly consume his beloved, but he was by her side. Years passed and Olivia died. John wanted to return. He was healthy. He underwent dozens of examinations. Doctors confirmed that he did not have leprosy. However, bureaucratic processes were merciless. The law stated, anyone who has entered the colony can never leave due to the fear of contagion. John Elia, a healthy man, became a lifelong prisoner on the island of the dead. He spent 30 years in Kalupa. He became a gardener, cultivating flowers. He tended to the graves. He witnessed his friends passing away. He watched as the world changed somewhere beyond the cliffs. He wrote letters pleading for freedom. It was only in 1937, when he was already an old man, that he was finally permitted to leave. But by then, it was too late. He could never adapt to his new life. He died a few years later, lonely and forgotten. His story is one of a tragic love that proved stronger than the fear of death and the cruelty of a system that overpowered common sense. John was confined to an island, but the hero of the next tale was trapped within a painting. He was a forger who created a masterpiece, deceived the Nazis, became a national hero, and, when he was tried, painted yet another masterpiece right in the courtroom to prove his innocence. Story number 12. The Forger Who Became a National Hero. Han van Meegeren was a talented yet unrecognized Dutch artist. Critics deemed his style outdated. In defiance of the world, he set out to prove that he was more brilliant than anyone thought. He decided to forge a Vermeer. He spent 6 years mastering the techniques of the great master. He found 15th century canvases, made his own paints from ancient pigments, using lapis lazuli and oil. He mixed them with bakelite, an early form of plastic, so the painting would appear old after being baked in an oven. In 1937, he unveiled to the world Christ at Emmaus, supposedly an unknown early work by Jan Vermeer. Experts were thrilled. The most esteemed art critic of that time, Abraham Bradius, called the painting Vermeer's masterpiece. The Boijmans Museum bought it for a substantial sum. Van Meegeren was elated. He had not only deceived critics, but had made them revere his work. During World War II, he continued to find Vermeers. One of his finest fakes, Christ and the Sinners, he sold to Hermann Göring, Hitler's right-hand man, in exchange for 137 authentic paintings by Dutch masters that the Nazis had transported out of the Netherlands. After the war, Dutch authorities began investigating how national treasures fell into the hands of the Nazis. They traced it back to Van Meegeren and arrested him for collaboration and selling cultural assets to the enemy. This was punishable by death. Van Meegeren found himself trapped. He could either die as a traitor or confess to being a genius forger. He chose the latter. "I did not sell a Vermeer to Göring," he claimed in court. "I sold him my own painting. I tricked that fat pig." No one believed him. Judges, prosecutors, experts, all laughed. "You can't paint a Vermeer," they told him. "Give me the canvases and paints," Van Meegeren responded, "and I will create another one right here." Under guard in the courtroom, he painted his final forgery, young Christ preaching in the temple. Holland was initially shocked, then exhilarated. A traitor transformed into a national hero, a man who deceived none other than Göring, extracting a fortune for a forgery. All accusations of collaboration were dismissed. He was sentenced for fraud and received merely a year in prison, but he never served his time. He passed away from a heart attack a month after the verdict, becoming a legend. Van Meegeren fooled the world with a paintbrush, while the hero of the next tale outsmarted death through mathematics. He was a statistician who calculated how to survive plane crashes, falling from planes 7 times, yet remaining alive by adhering to his own guidelines. Story number 13. The Professor Who Figured Out How Not to Die. Frane Selak was a music teacher from Croatia, but the world knows him as either the luckiest or unluckiest person on the planet. His life was a series of disasters from which he emerged unscathed. Destiny first tested him in 1962. The train he was riding derailed and plunged into an icy river. 17 people drowned. Frane, with a broken arm, managed to swim to shore. A year later, he was flying in an airplane. The aircraft's door ripped off, and he was sucked out without a parachute. 19 people lost their lives. Frane landed in a haystack. 3 years later, the bus he was on fell off a bridge into a river. 4 people perished. Frane swam to land with a few scratches, but it didn't stop there. His car caught fire twice. The first time, he jumped out a second before the gas tank exploded. The second time, flames erupted from the ventilation and singed his hair, but he survived. He was hit by a bus, but came away with minor bruises. On a mountain road, he narrowly escaped a careening truck. His car crashed through a guardrail and plummeted into a ravine. Frane didn't have time to jump out and grab a tree, watching as his vehicle exploded 150 meters below. 7 times he faced death, and 7 times he escaped. The pinnacle of his incredible life came in the form of the lottery. In 2003, at the age of 73, he bought a lottery ticket for the first time and won $1 million. It seemed he had found his happy ending, but Frane, who had survived so much adversity, realized that money was not what mattered most. He purchased 2 homes and a boat, distributing the remainder to friends and family. He stated, "I don't need money. I just need my Katika, my wife." He moved into a modest house where he sang songs with his guitar for the rest of his days, thanking God or the devil. He never quite decided given his extraordinary life. While Frane thrived amidst chaos, the hero of the subsequent tale, conversely, generated chaos in his pursuit of order. He was an urban planner who drew a straight line through the most densely populated city in the world, demolishing thousands of homes to create the perfect street. For this, he was cursed. Story number 14. The Man Who Sliced Through Paris. In the mid-19th century, Paris was not the city we recognize today. It was a medieval labyrinth with narrow, dark, dirty streets where cholera epidemics and revolutions erupted with alarming frequency. These streets were easy to barricade, and Parisians did so with remarkable regularity. Emperor Napoleon I concluded that it was time to make a change. He envisioned a new Paris, bright, spacious, modern, and, crucially, convenient for the movement of artillery. The executor of his will was Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann, the prefect of the Seine department. Haussmann was not an architect, he was an administrator, a bulldozer in human form. He took a map of Paris and drew straight lines across it with a ruler, disregarding whatever lay in their path. Thus began the Haussmannization of Paris. This was the most extensive and ruthless reconstruction of a city in history. Haussmann demolished 19,000 buildings. Entire neighborhoods where people had lived for centuries were wiped from the map. 100,000 individuals were displaced from their homes. In place of the winding streets, he carved wide, straight boulevards. He constructed new bridges, parks, and a sewage system that freed Paris from the plague. He created the very image of the city, with its iconic six-story buildings featuring mansard roofs that we cherish today. However, Parisians despised him. They referred to him as a barbarian and a vandal. He was accused of destroying the soul of old Paris. Writers cursed him for demolishing the homes of the heroes in their novels. Haussmann was unfazed by emotions. His focus was on efficiency. His boulevards were not only beautiful, but also strategically significant. It was impossible to build barricades on them. In the event of a riot, troops could swiftly reach any part of the city. He worked for 17 years. In 1870, when the empire of Napoleon II fell, Haussmann was immediately dismissed. He died in poverty and obscurity, but the city he created did survive. The paradox is that the man who was vilified as a destroyer is now regarded as the creator of modern Paris. We stroll along his boulevards admiring their beauty without considering how many tears and lives were buried beneath their cobblestones. Haussmann reshaped the city, but the hero of the next story reshaped time itself. He was a watchmaker who spent 40 years building a clock that never errs and solved a problem that had stumped Newton and Galileo. Yet for this, the Admiralty refused to pay him. Story number 15. The Watchmaker Who Conquered the Ocean. In the 15th century, the primary challenge of seafaring was longitude. Sailors could determine latitude by the stars, but were unaware of how far east or west they had traveled. An error of 1 degree meant a drift of 100 kilometers. Ships wrecked on reefs that seemed to appear out of nowhere or perished from starvation, unable to locate land. Thousands of lives were lost. The British government announced a reward of £20,000 sterling, worth millions of dollars today, to anyone who could resolve the longitude problem. Scholars from the Royal Society, including Isaac Newton, were convinced that the answer lay in the stars. It was necessary to create accurate maps of lunar distances. This was complicated, cumbersome, and required clear skies. But the solution did not come from an observatory. Rather, it emerged from a small workshop in London. It was discovered by John Harrison, a self-taught carpenter who became a brilliant watchmaker. Harrison realized that to know longitude, one must know the exact time. The Earth rotates at a speed of 15 degrees. If you know the time in Greenwich and can determine the local time by observing the sun, the difference will indicate your longitude. The issue was that the clocks of that era were pendulum-based. At sea, due to the rolling motion, changes in temperature, and humidity, they would lose a few minutes each day. A chronometer was needed that wouldn't err by more than a couple of seconds over months of sailing. This seemed impossible. Harrison dedicated 40 years of his life to creating the perfect marine chronometer. His initial model, H1, weighed 34 kilograms. It was a brass monstrosity with springs and balance wheels that compensated for the ship's movement. They worked, but the Admiralty declared, "Too complicated, too expensive." He developed H2 and then H3. Each iteration was an improvement, more compact and more accurate. He invented a bimetallic strip, still in use today in thermostats, along with ball bearings. He was a century ahead of his time in horology, but a council of astronomers sabotaged him. They didn't want some carpenter without formal education stealing their fame and fortune. Finally, at the age of 68, he crafted his masterpiece, H4. These were large pocket watches with a diameter of 13 centimeters. In 1761, H4 was sent on a voyage to Jamaica. After 81 days at sea, it was only 5 seconds slow. This was a triumph, but the Admiralty refused to pay. They imposed new, unattainable requirements. They forced the elderly man to disassemble the watch down to its last screw and replicate it. Harrison battled bureaucracy for another 10 years. It was only when he, in despair, appealed directly to King George II that the monarch intervened. "I swear by God, Harrison, you will receive your payment," the king exclaimed. At 80 years old, John Harrison finally received his reward. He passed away 3 years later, knowing that his determination had saved countless sailors' lives. Harrison fought against time, but the hero of the next story battled with language. He was the man who single-handedly created the most popular artificial language in the world, hoping to unite humanity. Yet, he faced persecution from both Hitler and Stalin. Story number 16. The Language of Hope. Ludwig Zamenhof grew up in the city of Bialystok, which was then part of the Russian Empire. It was Babel. On the streets, people spoke Polish, Russian, Yiddish, and German, while constantly fighting. Poles hated Russians, Russians loathed Germans, and together they all despised the Jews. Young Ludwig, a Jewish boy, believed that the root of all this hatred lay in language. People didn't understand each other, so they feared and hated one another. Thus, he decided to create a new language, a neutral, simple one that would belong to everyone and yet no one. A language that would serve as a bridge between peoples. He began working at the age of 10. He spent his entire youth working as an ophthalmologist by day and constructing his language by night. He drew roots and words from Germanic and Slavic languages. He designed an extremely simple grammar with only 16 rules, no exceptions, no genders for nouns, one ending for all verbs. In 1887, he published the first textbook under the pseudonym Dr. Esperanto, the Doctor of Hope. The language acquired this name. Esperanto became a sensation. The movement of hopefuls grew worldwide. People viewed it not merely as a linguistic experiment, but as a tool for achieving peace. Poems were written in Esperanto, the Bible was translated, and global congresses were held. It seemed that Mingo's dream was coming true. However, then the 20th century arrived. The Nazis despised Esperanto. For them, it was the language of Jews and communists, a means of a worldwide conspiracy. Hitler mentioned it in Mein Kampf. In Germany, Esperanto speakers were arrested, and their clubs were shut down. 3 of Mingo's children perished in the Holocaust. In the Soviet Union, Esperanto was initially encouraged, but later Stalin perceived it as a threat. Esperanto speakers are individuals who communicate with foreigners, and thus they are spies. Thousands of Soviet Esperantists were shot or sent to the Gulag. A language created for peace became a reason for persecution. Its founder, Ludwig, died in 1917, never witnessing how his creation fell under the oppressive weight of 2 of history's most dreadful dictatorships. Yet Esperanto survived. Today, it is spoken by an estimated 2 million people. It is the most successful artificial language in history, a living tribute to a little boy from Bialystok who believed that the right words could halt bullets. While Mingo created a language, the hero of the next story crafted silence. He was a composer who wrote a piece consisting of 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, igniting a global debate about what constitutes music. Story number 17. The Sound of Silence. John Cage was an American avant-garde composer. He believed that music encompasses not just harmony, but any sound around us. The noise of the street, the creak of a chair, a cough in the hall. All of this contributes to the world's sound score. In 1952, he sought to push this idea to its logical extreme. He composed his most famous work, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The piece comprises 3 movements, There are no notes written in the score. Instead, a single word is inscribed, tacit, or silence. The performer, usually a pianist, is required to remain silent for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The premiere took place at a concert hall in Woodstock. Pianist David Tudor took the stage. He sat at the piano, opened the lid, and did not touch the keys. The audience waited. 1 minute passed. Tudor closed the lid. The end of the first movement. He then opened it again. Silence. Another 2 minutes elapsed. He closed the lid, opened it again. Just over a minute remained. He closed it, stood up, and bowed. The audience erupted. Part of the crowd was furious. This was a fraud. We've been fooled. They shouted, stomped their feet, and left. Others were confused, while some laughed. But Cage remained serious. He stated, "There is no such thing as silence." While writing this piece, I entered a soundproof chamber at Harvard, but I heard two sounds. A high one, that was my nervous system, and a low one, which was my blood. The music was not the notes that the pianist did not play. The music emerged from the sounds made by the audience itself: coughing, creaking chairs, wind rustling outside, disgruntled murmurs. It was you, the audience, who were the orchestra. 4 minutes and 33 seconds became the most scandalous and philosophical piece of the 20th century. It is not a composition, but a frame for the picture that life itself paints. Cage compelled people to listen to silence and recognize that it is filled with sound. This piece is a challenge, a meditation, a joke. It continues to be performed worldwide, and each rendition sounds different because every venue and every moment is unique. Keach found music in silence, but the protagonist of the next story found light in darkness. She was a blind and deaf girl who was regarded as a wild animal, yet she learned to speak, graduated from Harvard, and became one of the greatest humanists of the century. Story number 18, Awakening in Darkness. Helen Keller was born a healthy child, but at 19 months she fell ill, likely with scarlet fever or meningitis, and lost both her sight and hearing. She found herself trapped in complete darkness and silence. She could not communicate. She had no understanding of what words were, or what the world around her meant. She behaved like a small wild animal, expressing her needs through cries and struggles. Her parents were in despair. Doctors suggested placing her in an institution for the mentally disabled, but they held on to one last hope: a 20-year-old teacher named Anne Sullivan. Anne herself was nearly blind and had grown up in an institution. She understood the meaning of isolation. She arrived at the Kellers' home and embarked on a battle for the mind of the little girl. She attempted to teach Helen words by drawing letters on her palm. She gave her a doll and wrote the word doll on her hand. Helen mimicked the motions but did not grasp the connection. It was merely a game to her. The breakthrough occurred at the water pump. Anne led Helen to the faucet. She placed one of the girl's hands under the stream of cold water while persistently spelling out W-A-T-E-R again and again. Suddenly, Helen froze. Light ignited in her brain. She understood that the cold, wet thing flowing over her hand and these signs were the same. Everything in the world has a name. She began to run around the yard, touching the ground, the grass, the fence, demanding that Anne name everything for her. That day, she learned 30 words. Her mind awakened. The prison crumbled. What followed was a miracle. Helen learned to read using Braille, to type on a special machine. She acquired the ability to hear by placing her fingers on the lips and throat of the speaker. She even learned to talk, although her voice remained rough and difficult to understand. She enrolled in Radcliffe College, the women's counterpart to Harvard. Anne Sullivan sat beside her in all the lectures, translating the professor's words onto her palm. In 1904, Helen Keller graduated with honors. She became a world-renowned writer, lecturer, and activist. She fought for women's rights and the rights of the disabled. She met with 12 U.S. presidents. She traveled around the globe. A woman who lived in a world devoid of sound and light, saw and heard more than most sighted and hearing individuals. Helen learned to speak, while the hero of the next story, in contrast, chose silence. He was the most famous mime in the world, who saved hundreds of Jewish children from the Nazis, using his art to teach them the most important lesson, the value of silence. Story number 19. The Mime Who Taught Children to Be Silent. Marcel Mangel grew up in Strasbourg, on the border of France and Germany. He was a Jewish boy who adored Charlie Chaplin. He dreamed of becoming a mime. However, in 1940, his dreams were invaded by the Nazis. His father was deported to Svenska and perished there. The 16-year-old Marcel and his brother Alain joined the French resistance. Marcel adopted the pseudonym Marceau in honor of a general from the French Revolution. His primary weapon was not a gun, but rather his talent. Marceau worked with an organization that rescued orphaned Jewish children. They were hidden in shelters and then secretly smuggled across the border into neutral Switzerland. But how could a group of frightened, crying children be led through the woods past German patrols? Any sound could cost them their lives. This is where Marcel Marceau utilized his artistry. He played with them. He portrayed funny little characters, walked a tightrope, and wrestled with the wind. He captivated the children. They laughed, but quietly. He taught them to be silent, not through commands, but through play. He showed them that silence was part of the performance, part of the adventure. During one of the crossings through the Alps, he led a group of 24 children. They stumbled upon a German patrol. The soldiers could have shot them all, but Marceau began to improvise. He staged an entire performance, distracting the Germans while the children hid in the bushes. The Germans, thinking he was merely a wandering artist, laughed and left. He undertook 3 such journeys, saving hundreds of lives. He said, "My best performance was not on stage. It was in the woods." After the liberation of Paris, he gave his first major concert in front of 3,000 American soldiers. He silently showcased the horrors of war, fear, struggle, hope. The soldiers cried. After the war, Marcel Marceau created his famous character, the clown Bip, with a white face and a flower on his hat. He became the most renowned mime in the world. Millions admired his art. But few knew that behind the sad smile of the clown lay the story of a boy who saved children by teaching them to play in silence. Marceau saved children with silence, but the hero of the next story saved a city with noise, or rather, a sound that was absent. He was a sound designer who created the most famous sound effect in film history, a sound you have heard thousands of times but do not know the name of. Story number 20. The scream you have heard 1,000 times. If you have watched Star Wars, Indiana Jones, The Lord of the Rings, or almost any action film made in the last 50 years, you have heard it. It is a sharp, piercing scream that a character emits when they fall from a height, get shot, or are eaten by a dinosaur. This sound is known as the Wilhelm scream. Its story began in 1951 during the filming of the western Distant Drums. In one scene, a soldier walking through a swamp is bitten and pulled underwater by an alligator. The director requested a realistic scream of terror be recorded. 6 takes were made. The 5th take, performed by actor Sheb Woolley, was perfect, a piercing, desperate, slightly comedic wail. The recording containing the sound ended up in the Warner Brothers studio archive. 2 years later, in the western Fury at Red River, a character named Private Wilhelm gets hit in the leg by an arrow. Sound designer Ben Burt, searching for the right sound, stumbled upon that very recording. He used take number 5. Thus, the scream acquired its name. This is where the inside joke began. Ben Burt and his fellow sound engineers started embedding the Wilhelm scream into every film they worked on. It became their secret signature, a hidden Easter egg. While working on Star Wars, Burt placed the scream in the scene where a stormtrooper falls into the chasm on the Death Star. In Indiana Jones, he utilized it when a Nazi falls from a truck. The joke quickly spiraled out of control. Other sound designers caught on to it. The Wilhelm scream transformed into a cultural phenomenon. Quentin Tarantino, Peter Jackson, and Steven Spielberg have all made use of it. It can be heard in Transformers, Toy Story, and Beauty and the Beast. This sound has become the most famous sound cliché in film history, appearing in over 400 movies. We hear it without realizing it's the same scream recorded 70 years ago for a film that few remember. It is a ghost from the audio archives, living its own life, dying over and over again on screen for our entertainment. The Wilhelm scream has achieved immortality, but the hero of the next story, in stark contrast, sought immortality and instead found death in a cauldron of molten metal. He was the first emperor of China, the builder of the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army, yet he met his demise after consuming a life elixir made of mercury. This is story number 21, The Emperor Who Was Killed by Immortality. Qin Shi Huangdi was the man who created China. He unified warring states, standardized the written language, currency, and weights and measures. He built the Great Wall to defend against barbarian invasions. He was a genius, a tyrant, and a paranoid figure. But above all, he feared death. Having unified the realm, he set a new goal: to conquer time. He dispatched expeditions in search of the mythical islands of the immortals, where, according to legend, fruits granting eternal life grew. The ships departed, but none returned. He then turned to alchemists. Court magicians and charlatans promised him a life elixir. They claimed to have discovered a secret formula, the main ingredient being mercury. In ancient Chinese medicine, liquid silver was believed to possess magical properties capable of extending life. The emperor began taking mercury pills daily, convinced they would render him invulnerable. However, in reality, they were gradually killing him. Mercury is a neurotoxin that damages the brain and nervous system. As time went on, the emperor's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He suffered from fits of rage, paranoia, and hallucinations. He ordered the burning of all historical texts to ensure history began with him. He executed hundreds of scholars, burying them alive. He was preparing for death. Even in his quest for immortality, he constructed an elaborate tomb, a vast underground palace. For its protection, he commanded the creation of a terracotta army, 8,000 life-sized clay warriors, along with horses and chariots. Each warrior bore a unique face. According to historian Sima Qian, the tomb featured rivers of mercury designed to emulate the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, with a ceiling adorned with pearls depicting stars. In 210 BC, during a journey across the country, the 49-year-old emperor is believed to have died from mercury poisoning. His advisors, fearing a rebellion, concealed his demise. They transported his body in a sealed carriage for an additional 2 months. To mask the stench of decomposition, they ordered a cart filled with salted fish to follow. Qin Shi Huangdi, a man who sought eternal life, succumbed to his own remedy, while his body traveled the land alongside spoiled fish. The emperor searched for life in poison, but the hero of the next tale discovered poison within wallpaper. He was the greatest conqueror in history, who died in exile on a tiny island. It took 200 years for scholars to realize that it was not cancer that claimed his life, but rather the color of his bedroom. Story number 22. Napoleon's Green Wallpaper. In 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte, once the ruler of Europe, passed away on the island of St. Helena. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, yet rumors of poisoning had circulated from the very start. The main suspect was the British governor who held Napoleon captive. The mystery remained unsolved for nearly 2 centuries. In the late 20th century, scientists gained access to strands of Napoleon's hair, which had been cut after his death. Testing revealed shocking results. His hair contained a vast amount of arsenic, at 40 times the normal level. This served as evidence of poisoning. But who was the murderer? Swedish scientist Sten Forshavud initiated his own investigation. He examined the diaries of Napoleon's servants, his symptoms, and daily routine, but could not find the answer. Then he came across a description of the house where Napoleon lived. Longwood House was a damp, decrepit building, and the walls of the emperor's favorite room, his bathroom, where he spent hours, were adorned with bright green wallpaper. For Forshavud, this was the key. In the 19th century, the most fashionable color was a green shell, a vivid emerald hue. It was created using a pigment that contained copper acetate and arsenic trioxide. This color was everywhere, in clothing, paints, artificial flowers, and naturally, in wallpaper. No one knew that this beauty was a slow killer. In the humid climate of St. Helena, mold thrived on the wallpaper. The fungus consuming the glue triggered a chemical reaction with the pigment, releasing toxic gas called trimethyl arsenic into the air. For years, Napoleon inhaled arsenic. Every day, as he took a bath, he breathed in the poison that evaporated from his beloved green walls. This explained all his symptoms: nausea, abdominal pain, and hair loss. It was not a swift death from poison in his wine, but rather a prolonged, tormenting poisoning from within his own home. The murderer of Napoleon was not a British spy. The assassin was fashion. Napoleon was killed by color, yet the hero of the following story, conversely, survived thanks to color. He was an artist who ended up in a gulag and stayed alive by painting portraits of Stalin on thin paper. Story number 23. A portrait of the leader as salvation. Mikhail Sokolov was an artist of the Silver Age, a friend of Akhmatova and Mandelstam. His style, expressive and edgy, far removed from socialist realism, was branded as formalism. In 1938, he was arrested. He was tortured, forced to confess to espionage. He did not confess. He was sentenced to 7 years in a labor camp and sent to the Taiga station in Siberia. For an artist accustomed to the serene lifestyle of Leningrad, the camp was a living hell. Hunger, cold, scurvy, and back-breaking work felling trees surrounded him. People perished by the hundreds. Sokolov, an intellectual with glasses, was expected to die first, but art saved him. Upon learning that Sokolov was a painter, the camp commander summoned him. He wanted a portrait of Stalin, but there were no canvases or paints available in the camp. Sokolov was provided with a piece of plywood and whatever materials they could gather: soot, brick dust, and laundry blue. Instead of brushes, he used splinters and his fingers. He created the portrait, which pleased the commander. Art became his second profession, his shield. While others were busy cutting down trees, Sokolov painted. He portrayed the camp leadership, their wives, and children. He illustrated slogans such as, "Thank you, Comrade Stalin, for our happy childhood." Yet, even within these confines, he remained an artist. At night, in the barracks, he worked for himself. On tiny scraps of cigarette paper, using charcoal from the stove or a broken pencil, he fashioned his own world. He painted landscapes from memory: Venice, Paris. He depicted Don Quixote battling the camp watchtowers. He captured the gaunt faces of his fellow inmates. Tragically, these tiny drawings the size of postage stamps became acts of resistance. He concealed them in his sleeve or sewed them into the lining of his overcoat. Mikhail Sokolov survived, being freed in 1943. He returned to Moscow, but he was a broken man. He was banned from exhibiting his work. He died in poverty, in a small room within a communal apartment. Only after his death, when his miniature masterpieces were discovered, did the world recognize the true extent of his talent. The artist whom the regime sought to erase had preserved his soul on scraps of paper, proving that art can endure even where humanity fades. Sokolov survived thanks to the portrait of a tyrant. In contrast, the hero of the next story perished because of a portrait of his wife. He was a scientist who discovered X-rays but refused to patent them, believing they should belong to all mankind, and ultimately died from cancer caused by his own invention. Story number 24. The man who saw his wife's bones. Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen. In 1895, he was conducting experiments with cathode rays in his laboratory. One evening, he noticed a strange glow. A screen made of barium located at the opposite end of the room began to light up, even though the cathode tube was covered with black cardboard. Röntgen realized that he had discovered a new invisible type of radiation. He named it X-rays. He sequestered himself in the laboratory for 6 weeks, hardly sleeping or eating. He placed various objects in the path of the rays: a book through which he could see the lead bookmark inside, a wooden box, revealing the nails within. On December 22nd, he invited his wife, Anna Bertha, to the laboratory. He asked her to place her hand on the photographic plate, and directed the rays at her. When he developed the image, they were both horrified. The photograph revealed the bones of her hand and the wedding ring hanging on the bone of her finger like a ghost. "I saw my own death," Anna Bertha said. This marked the first X-ray image of a human in history. The discovery created an uproar. The world went wild. Newspapers wrote about rays that could see through clothing. Opportunistic entrepreneurs began selling X-ray-proof underwear. Doctors immediately started using the rays for diagnosing fractures. Offers were made to Röntgen to patent his invention, which would have made him a multi-millionaire, but he declined. "My discovery belongs to all humanity," he stated. He didn't accept a single cent for the utilization of his technology. In 1901, he received the first ever Nobel Prize in physics. He donated the money to his university. However, there was a dark side. No one was aware that radiation was hazardous. Röntgen and other pioneers of radiology worked without any protection. They would place their hands under the rays to adjust the machine. Many of them developed cancer. Their fingers were covered in sores, their skin peeled away, and they died in agony. Röntgen himself passed away in 1923 from intestinal cancer, likely related to his work. He gifted humanity a tool that saved millions of lives, but he paid for it with his own. Röntgen observed what was hidden. In contrast, the hero of the next story revealed to everyone what was in plain sight but went unnoticed. He was a photographer who captured motion, slicing seconds into frames, and he chose to settle a debate on whether a horse lifts all 4 feet off the ground while galloping. Story number 25, the debate over the flying horse. In the 19th century, artists depicted galloping horses in the pose of a soaring swallow, with their front legs extended forward and back legs stretched backward. This looked beautiful and heroic. But was this how a horse really ran? This question tormented Leland Stanford, a former governor of California, a railroad magnate, and a passionate horse racing enthusiast. He wagered $25,000 with a friend, a significant amount in those times, betting that at some point during a gallop, all 4 legs of the horse would leave the ground simultaneously. But how was this to be proven? The human eye could not capture such rapid movement. Stanford hired Edward Muybridge, an eccentric English photographer. Muybridge was known for his landscapes and the fact that he killed his wife's lover, which he was acquitted of in a trial that found it justified homicide. The task seemed impossible. Cameras at that time required long exposure times. Muybridge spent 5 years and a fortune belonging to Stanford. He transformed the racetrack into a laboratory. Along the track, he set up 24 cameras. Each camera's shutter was connected to a thread stretched across the track. As the horse ran by, it would break the threads, one after another, triggering the cameras. In 1878, the experiment succeeded. Muybridge captured a series of images that broke down the horse's movement into phases. He demonstrated that Stanford was correct. The horse actually lifts all 4 legs off the ground. Yet that was also a shock to everyone. It does this not in the swallow-like pose, but at the moment when all 4 legs are tucked under its belly. The swallow pose was an artist's invention. But Muybridge went further. He invented the zoopraxiscope, a device that projected his photographs onto a screen in quick succession. When he turned the knob, the horse on the screen galloped. This marked the birth of cinema, a decade before the Lumiere brothers. Edward Muybridge, in his quest to resolve a debate about horses, inadvertently created film. He revealed to the world what lies hidden between moments, forever altering our perception of reality. Muybridge halted time, but the hero of the next story, in contrast, sought to speed it up. He was a mathematician who predicted the existence of a planet using only pen and paper. However, his discovery was stolen because he was too young and humble. This is story number 26, the planet found at the tip of a pen. In 1843, the astronomical community was in turmoil. The planet Uranus was behaving strangely. It orbited in ways that did not align with Newton's laws. It would accelerate and decelerate unpredictably. There was only one explanation. There had to be another invisible planet beyond Uranus, tugging at it with its gravity. The quest to locate this planet X became the foremost scientific race of the century. John Couch Adams was a 24-year-old mathematics student from Cambridge. He was a genius, albeit very modest and shy. He resolved to calculate the position of the unknown planet. For 2 years, he pored over papers, scribbling hundreds of pages filled with complex equations. He took into account the gravity of the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn. It was a monumental effort that today's supercomputers undertake. In September 1845, Adams achieved a breakthrough. He calculated the mass, orbit, and precise location of planet X in the sky. He sent his findings to Sir George Airy, the royal astronomer, at the Greenwich Observatory. But Airy was an arrogant snob. He could not believe that a mere student could solve one of the greatest mysteries in astronomy. He filed away Adams's papers and forgot about them. Simultaneously, in France, the same problem was being tackled by Urbain Le Verrier, a well-known and respected mathematician. Unbeknownst to him, Adams had already been working on this. Le Verrier also spent months on calculations and reached almost the same conclusion. He submitted his findings to the Berlin Observatory's astronomer, Johann Galle. He wrote, "Point your telescope at this location and you will find the planet." On the night of September 23, 1846, Galle did just that, and within 1 degree of the predicted point, he spotted a small blue star that was not on any charts. It was Neptune. A scandal erupted internationally. The English claimed that the French had stolen their discovery, while the French accused the English of fraud. Only when Adams's notes were published did it become clear that he had found Neptune a year earlier. However, due to bureaucracy and snobbery, his discovery was buried. Ultimately, the fame of being the discoverers was shared between both, Adams and Le Verrier. Adams held no grudges. He was far too engulfed in science. Yet his story serves as a lesson that genius without audacity often remains in the shadows. Adams located the planet, but the hero of the next story found a virus. Not just any virus, but one that kills bacteria. This discovery could save the world from antibiotic resistance, but his findings were overlooked because he was an eccentric and impulsive Canadian. Story number 27. The Enemy of My Enemy. Felix Drell was a self-taught Canadian microbiologist. He did not possess a university diploma. He learned while working as a lab assistant. He was brilliant yet unbearable, impulsive, arrogant, and constantly clashing with his superiors. In 1917, during the First World War, he was employed at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. He was asked to address an outbreak of dysentery among soldiers. Drell collected samples from the ill, cultivated dysentery bacteria on petri dishes, and observed something peculiar. Occasionally, small, perfectly round areas appeared on the solid carpet of bacteria where all the bacteria were dead. At first, he thought it was a defect, but the areas reappeared. Drell hypothesized that there was an invisible killer, something that preyed on the bacteria. He extracted liquid from one of those areas, filtered it to retain the bacteria, and added a drop of this clear liquid to a new colony. The following morning, the entire colony was dead. Drell realized that he had discovered a virus that infected and killed bacteria. He named it bacteriophage, meaning bacteria eater. This was a groundbreaking discovery. If a virus existed that killed dysentery bacteria, then there must be others that could eliminate germs causing cholera, plague, and staphylococcus. It was a formidable weapon against any infection. Drell began treating patients. He administered a phage cocktail to those suffering from dysentery, and they recovered in just 1 day. He halted the cholera epidemic in India by treating wells with phages. He treated the plague in Egypt. It seemed like a panacea, but the scientific community did not accept him. First, phages were unpredictable. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. Second, Drell was a self-taught individual with a terrible disposition. His ideas were dismissed as quackery. Then Fleming discovered penicillin. Antibiotics were simpler, more reliable, and profitable. Phages were forgotten for 50 years. Only in the Soviet Union, particularly in Georgia, did phage therapy continue to evolve. Today, as the world grapples with the issue of superbugs resistant to all antibiotics, Scientists are once again recalling the hot-tempered Canadian and his eaters of bacteria. Phage therapy is experiencing a renaissance. A discovery made a century ago could become our primary weapon in the future. Drell found the invisible killer, but the hero of the next story, conversely, sought invisible life. He was a fabric merchant who, in his spare time, polished lenses and became the first person to see the microbial world, referring to them as little beasts. Story number 28, The Merchant Who Discovered the Invisible Universe. Antony van Leeuwenhoek was not a scientist. He was a Dutch fabric merchant in the city of Delft during the 17th century. His job involved counting threads and fabrics to determine their quality. For this, he used magnifying glasses. However, the magnifiers available for purchase were subpar. Thus, Leeuwenhoek, a person with golden hands and insatiable curiosity, began crafting his own. He learned to polish tiny lenses the size of a pinhead. He achieved such mastery that his microscopes magnified objects 270 times, 10 times more powerful than any scientific instrument of that era. And he began to observe everything around him. He examined a bee's sting, the eye of a fly, the scales of a fish, but one day he decided to take a look at a drop of rainwater from a barrel. What he discovered left him astounded. In the droplet, which turned out to be absolutely clear, life was teeming. Thousands of tiny beings scurried back and forth. They tumbled, swam, and jostled each other. He named them animalcules, little beasts. Leeuwenhoek became the colossus of the microcosm. He was the first person to see bacteria, protozoa, and spermatozoa. He examined his own semen, the quote, blood cells. He started writing letters to the Royal Society in London, the most prestigious scientific academy in the world. In his letters, penned in simple Dutch, he enthusiastically described his findings with a childlike wonder. The scholars in London initially laughed. A cloth merchant who sees little creatures in water. Madness, they thought. They presumed he was either insane or a fraud. However, Leeuwenhoek was persistent. He sent so many detailed descriptions and illustrations that the scientists had no choice but to investigate. They constructed their microscopes and, to their astonishment, observed the same phenomena. Leeuwenhoek became a celebrity. Kings and emperors, including Peter the Great, traveled to Delft to gaze through his magical lenses. He crafted over 500 microscopes, but never revealed the secret of his lenses to anyone. He took it with him to his grave. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, an uneducated merchant, single-handedly unveiled a new invisible universe that exists parallel to our own, laying the foundations for microbiology. Leeuwenhoek perceived small life, but the hero of the next tale witnessed great death. He was a priest who kept a diary during the siege of his city amidst the 30 Years' War. His writings are the only remnants of an entire world reduced to ashes. Story number 29, The Diary of the End of the World. The 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, was one of the most brutal conflicts in European history. It was a slaughterhouse where religion, politics, and greed blended into a bloody cocktail. Germany lost a third of its population. Entire regions became desolate wasteland. However, we know about the horrors of this war not just from dry generals' reports. We know about them thanks to the diary of a village priest from Bavaria named Gans Heuser. His village, Dyson, found itself in the path of the armies. The Swedes, Spaniards, French, and Imperials all passed through. Each army brought with it plunder, violence, and plague. Gans Heuser kept a diary. He recorded everything. He described not great battles but small tragedies. How soldiers evicted his family from their home and turned it into a stable. How his neighbors were tortured for their non-existent savings. How his daughter died of the plague in his arms. He wrote about the hunger that was more terrifying than the soldiers. Today we ate a soup made from nettles and herbs, he wrote. The children weep, but there is no bread. A neighbor butchered his last cat. He chronicled the breakdown of humanity, how people ceased burying the dead, how brother turned against brother over a piece of bread. Yet, his diary is not only a chronicle of terror, it is also a story of resilience. He documented how they concealed grain in the woods, how women defended one another from rapists, and how they continued to pray in a ruined church. The most poignant entry came after yet another raid. They took everything, but they could not seize the sunrise. It remains beautiful. Hans Heuser survived the war. He passed away in his old age, having lived to see peace. His diary, which he named Diary, was discovered in the archives of a monastery only in the 19th century. This is not a historical record. It is a cry from the soul, the voice of a little man lost in a grand narrative, proving that even when the world collapses, one can maintain light within by simply writing the truth. Heuser preserved the past, but the heroine of the next story, in contrast, attempted to erase it. She was a woman who married the Eiffel Tower and fought for the right of people to love inanimate objects. No, that seems too strange. Let's select something more down to earth. The protagonist of our final story was a woman who became the most renowned sharpshooter in history, but not in war, rather at a fair. She bested all the men, became the star of Buffalo Bill's show, and taught the world that a woman could shoot better than any cowboy. This is Annie Oakley. Story number 30. A Small, Steadfast Hand. Cincinnati, Ohio, Thanksgiving, 1975. The famous traveling marksman Frank Butler arrived in town. He was a star, a showman. He issued a wager, $100 to any local who could defeat him in a clay pigeon shoot. Butler was invincible, and he knew it. The owner of the local hotel where Butler was staying took up the challenge. "I have a shooter," he proclaimed. On the appointed day, a crowd gathered at the shooting range. Frank Butler, a tall, self-assured man, took his position. He awaited his opponent. And then, from the crowd emerged a small, slender teenage girl. She was only 15 years old. Her name was Annie Mose, but the world would remember her by a different name. She wore a simple homespun dress and held an old rifle belonging to her father. The crowd chuckled, then burst into laughter. Butler smiled. Was this a joke? It was no joke. They began to shoot. 25 shots. Butler, as always, was flawless. He hit target after target. But the girl didn't miss either. Her movements were calm and precise. She didn't aim. She simply lifted the rifle and shot, as though it were an extension of her arm. On the 25th shot, Frank Butler's nerves faltered. He missed. Annie hit all 25. This 15-year-old girl from the backwoods defeated the best shooter in America. But this story is not just about victory. It's what happened next that matters. Frank Butler did not get angry. He fell in love. He was so impressed by her talent and humility that a year later they married. And he made an unimaginable choice for a man of that era. He stepped into the shadows. He became her assistant and manager. She rose to stardom. Annie Oakley. She joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and became a worldwide sensation. What she did with the rifle seemed like magic. She could knock the ash off a cigarette that her husband held between his teeth. She could hit the edge of a playing card tossed into the air and slice it in half. She would shoot while glancing in a mirror over her shoulder. She tossed 10 glass marbles into the air and managed to shatter them all before they touched the ground. The Native American chief, Sitting Bull, was so impressed by her performance that he adopted her and gave her the name Watanya Cecilia, meaning Little Sure Shot. One day in Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II asked her to perform a trick with a cigarette balanced in his mouth. Annie expertly knocked off the ash with a shot. Years later, when World War I broke out, she joked, "If I had shot better, maybe we could have avoided this war." Annie Oakley was not merely a circus performer. She was an icon. She proved that a woman could be stronger, more accurate, and bolder than any man. She taught 15,000 women how to shoot. Volume 4 is now closed. We have witnessed how one person's mistake can alter the planet's climate, how silence can save lives, and how the truth can kill. We've seen brilliant discoveries languish in archives while mad ideas transform the world. These stories are not fabrications. They stand as proof that the human spirit, will, and even foolishness are the most powerful forces in the universe. They bend reality, break laws, and pen chronicles that are hard to believe. But remember, The most incredible story may begin tomorrow, with you.